Hi, it's Susan with a big treat for you today. Oh my goodness. Feast your eyes on this large bed quilt. This pattern is called Nearly Insane for obvious reasons. Look at all the teeny tiny pieces involved. This was a big challenge. It was a marathon. This spent 3 weeks on my long arm, during which time I did nothing else. It's traditional, so I didn't want it quilted really heavily. I wanted the blocks to stand out because they're the stars of the show. So I had lots of yummy white space, but I didn't want to interfere. So I did I tried to do really simple quilting throughout the whole thing. I tried to quilt the blocks lightly, and mostly I succeeded. You could have a field day with a quilt like this. Look at those little pieces. But it would take forever. See, it was 3 weeks on the machine just quilting it lightly. Think how expensive it would be and how time consuming if I'd really gone after the sashing and the border. This client, Alice, always attempts really challenging quilts and, just a whole lot of handwork. This quilt, there may be some machine piecing in here, but by far most of it is handwork. She uses papers. So some of these blocks I have no idea how she put together. It's just really impressive. Look at those tiny pieces. This was fun. This makes me think of like a Dear Jane, which I've always resisted quilting. And I don't know if this is on a par, but I kind of think it is. This is one of my favorite blocks of hers. Look what she does with the fabrics. This was one of the only heavily quilted blocks in the thing. I love that red line. Check out the scale. And this is probably my favorite block, because at first I didn't realize, but look at the tiny star. Look at those tiny pieces in the middle. I love what she did with the fabric here. So let's get into it. Okay, so it's a sampler. So I want to rely on basic freehand staple quilting. It's really just ditch quilting, even though there weren't many ditches, but so straight lines, continuous curves, arcs. I outlined the prints where the fabrics were speaking to me. See here those circles? That was jumping out at me. I outlined the little cat faces and some little flowers and that kind of thing. So really simple quilting. But when you quilt a sampler, which I love to do, they're so much fun because each block is different. She duplicated some blocks in here, but still, I like variety. I don't like to quilt the same thing over and over and over and over and over. So with each block, it's like, okay, what am I going to do here? And it's like solving a little puzzle. I'm not crazy about puzzles, but I like solving the quilting puzzle of what am I going to do here? And to keep the sashing from being an overwhelming, laborious chore, I would switch back and forth. If I happened to be at a place where the sashing was handy to quilt, I would quilt it. So I'm going back and forth between the sashing and the block. with a quilt like this, it's going to be difficult to quilt in one continuous line. That's just not going to happen. So there were lots of stops and starts. And what precipitates a lot of stops and starts is I don't know what I'm going to do here. So I'll lock off and go to some other part where I do have a better idea of what I'm going to do. And see those red squares in the cornerstones. So, that's just continuous curves. So I'd quilt those whenever I got there. I'm quilting with white So Fine by Superior, which is a pretty spindly little thread. And I knew that I just want one color thread. So the white thread is going to contrast on the red, and there's just no way around that. But that's a little bit of a selling point, I think. And okay, the other housekeeping matter is I put Hobbs 80/20 batting in here because it's lightweight and a little bit puffy, and that's exactly what I wanted. This is a large bed quilt. She made it bigger than the pattern calls for. She made more blocks. So it's a great big quilt, and I didn't want it to be heavy. This pattern is no longer in print. It's, she had, I don't know how many requests, can I have your pattern when you're done? And no, you can't have her pattern. She already gave it away to somebody. I'm not trying to be very super accurate about outlining. I just went for it. I should say at the outset, really, this is a red and white quilt. That's one of my favorite things in the world. But I cannot overstate that with a red and white quilt, especially one with all this work in it, oh my goodness. You really, if you're going to undertake something like this, you want to pre-wash those reds. I recently, because I've been burned so many times, bought a new bottle of Retain and one of Synthropol. So I took all the reds and burgundies and some purples and various other colors in my stash. Big pieces and little tiny pieces. The little tiny pieces you can put in a lingerie bag and toss them in the washing machine. They will not disintegrate. And I washed them first in Retain and then in Synthropol to set the color and keep it from bleeding. And I chose to go for all kinds of simple, freehand, time-honored little quilting patterns in here so that I wouldn't have to mark anything. Because, I would hate for anybody to have to get a mark out of a quilt like this. I did stabilize with clear thread, and all that was ditch quilting between the borders and in between the blocks and sashing. But all the rest of it was in the white. And so this was, I guess part of the trick was, well, it's hard for me to quilt lightly. I can always think of, all the bells and whistles, but the simple way to quilt it eludes me. And so I was trying the whole time to use restraint here. And I don't know that I achieved it. I think I did overall, but at the end of it, I kind of wished I'd quilted a little bit heavier. That's just going to be a matter of opinion. You know, that's going to differ from person to person. How much time and effort, you know, but I didn't want to squash anything. And in retrospect, I think the sashing is pretty under-quilted. I like how it's nice and puffy and light, but I think in relation to the scale of the little pieces in the blocks, I don't know if that was the right way to go. You know, that's a judgment call. But at least that part of it is not over-quilted. A lot of stuff in here was like quilting a miniature quilt. Not all the blocks, but some. And I thought, okay, I'm just going to get on here and fly through. And, you know, no. No flying. This is a traditional pattern. The original quilt, you know, this is based on a quilt, I think, made in the 1800s. And it's all really super traditional. Browns and cheddar and, you know, reproduction fabrics is what the pattern was made up in. This is just the kind of quilt that you'll hear people saying, oh yeah, I started one of those. But they don't finish because it's a really daunting task. And this is not a pattern for someone new to quilting. This is for the unafraid. When I was quilting this quilt, the song running through my head the whole time was Go Insane by Lindsey Buckingham of Fleetwood Mac. And Lindsey says, like the opening line of the song is, two kinds of people in this world. And I think that's right. I think there's the kind of person who would attempt a quilt this big and in a pattern this intricate and daunting, and those who would not. And that's a great song. Check it out. Look on YouTube or something. Look for the 1997 live version, not the one on the album. That's a whole different song. Lindsey is quite the singer, and gosh, he plays the guitar with his fingers without a pick, and that's just amazing. That's really good. So also in the interest of not detracting from the blocks with the quilting, notice that narrow red border there on the left. Ordinarily, this is where I would say, this is totally where you want a contrasting thread. Yeah, but not on this quilt. No way. There's plenty of contrast within that big body of the quilt. So I quilted that part in red. The backing is such that we were not going to end up with a white whole cloth. So I was emboldened to quilt with red thread, which is something I rarely do. I think red thread is harsh and it looks like it's bleeding or something. But here, this was not that. You know, red was just the way to go. And I just did a simple ribbon candy. It's just a linear meander. Well, I say linear just because the piece of fabric was linear, but so ribbon candy is a meander that makes a bunch of tessellating circles. And that was the only thing on the quilt that went really quickly. All the rest of this is slow, ponderous work. On this block, the lines in the outer triangles spoke to me. So I decided to quilt along there. I like the way that turned out. I really like it a lot. Some of these were pretty darn easy, and others I was really wondering what I was going to do. And I'm loving all, the way she used her fabrics. Look at the small scale prints. These blocks are 6 inches, and so many of them have lots of pieces. So a large print isn't going to work on a quilt like this. Look at the little bitty checks, the teeny tiny rows of circles and itty bitty checks. And I like how she fussy cut those little white flowers in the squares of that 9 patch. And what good contrast with that stripe. In the sashing, what I'm doing is a double line. Probably I had room for 3 lines, or I don't know, lines in some other direction. You got a lot of options here. I kind of did some math and decided what the increment I wanted to be in between the double lines. And still, it did not end up being at all precise. This is still, all the quilting here is pretty darn freehand looking. The quilt top itself is not perfect. How could it be with, little pieces like this? There's just too many. When you go to make a miniature block, you have to be, well, all of the imperfections are going to show. I've tried. It's really hard. You'll spend a lot of time doing it. So the sashing is not as perfect as I would have liked for it to be, but hey, I did the best I could because I didn't want to spend loads of time on that part. I don't think you're going to notice the sashing. I mean, the blocks are taking up all the attention. That's where your eye needs to go in the first place. The straight lines in the sashing were simple, and that's what I wanted. And so they're a nice counterpart to the lines that ended up going in the border. And stay tuned. I mean, I understand this is a super long video. Stay tuned toward the end for a big old lesson on how to put a border on a quilt. That's a topic I feel strongly about as a machine quilter because I've had so many over the years that were such a big challenge. And included in that lesson is an explanation of the grain line, which is extremely important in quilting. So many people have no idea what that even is. And it makes a big difference in how your quilt hangs and how flat it is and how well the block is going to go together, and especially the success of the border. So probably on this quilt I should have quilted the border first, but I didn't know what I was going to do. So I went for the part that I did know what I wanted to do. I made the decision on the sashing pretty quickly. I really like quilting samplers. They're one of my favorite types of quilts to quilt. If you were going to quilt one of these yourself and you don't like quilting samplers, I think this would have been probably not a lot of fun. You'd be there for a long time. It might be tedious. The woman who made this quilt loves the challenge, and I love the challenge of the quilting. So I was thoroughly engrossed. I was prepared for weeks here, so I didn't rush, and I didn't want to burn out. I mean, I thought there was a great chance I'd be sick and tired of this thing, but that didn't really happen. I lucked out. It was an exciting discovery every day to think, what cool block do I get to quilt next? Which is, I guess, how I ended up being a machine quilter in the first place. The first time I saw Harriet Hargrave's machine quilting book, the second edition, I guess, the red one, it winked at me in the store, and I had the urge to merge with it straight away. I ran right over to it and bought it, read it like it was a novel. I couldn't wait to do it. And I know lots of people have asked me, which machine should I get, and what's the best ruler, and all of those kind of questions. So my question for people is, do you burn to machine quilt? Do you just itch to get your hands on a machine and start doing it? If that isn't your approach, if you don't have that feeling, I don't know how much you're going to love it. Okay, so when it got to this part of the block, I thought, well, this is where you rely on your time-honored little motifs that you do all the time. And that's how this part of it got to get done so quickly. These are just little orange peels. I've done it a million times, and I thought it would be really cute in this part because I didn't want to leave it blank and I didn't want to do anything else in here. So I just continuous curved the 9 patch and went for that little narrow border with the orange peels, and I think it's darling. I love the way that turned out. Really happy with it. Look at those tiny pieces. It was kind of difficult to decide what to do on the itty-bittiest pieces. Ditch quilt in there, leave them blank, cross-hatch them. I was amazed at how many good alternatives there were. And I liked the corner patches on this block. So I just kind of outlined them, or inlined them, I guess you could say. So why ditch quilt if there was no ditch? So that the block doesn't end up looking like an unmade bed. What you don't quilt down stands up. So your unquilted seams need to either look good, or I think that's where you put a straight line. I'm deciding where to go next. In what order? To limit the stops and starts. What I'm doing there is nudging the fabric so it doesn't want to bunch up and pleat. I appreciated how she cut that little print out, and that made me think, well, let's just quilt up and down those lines. That was a nice, simple way. And see here, I'm quilting the straight line without a ruler. Anybody can do that. I didn't think it was possible the first time I heard about it, but okay. And see, quilting that little square, I think that's wonderful. It provided great texture, and it makes the fabric look, well, it makes the print look really good. I think it features the print. So I love that tactic. It makes it nice, neat, and tailored. I'm kind of sneaking up on that middle of the block because I don't know what I want to do in there. One interesting thing, this client, Alice, is on Instagram, and she likes to post pictures of her work as she's doing it. So it's pretty fascinating to go on there and see her progress. I loved to wake up in the morning and check the feed to see if she'd put anything up, and then just gasp. You know, look what she did here. Look how many of these she's cranked out. It was incredible. So her handle on Instagram is Home with Alice, in case you want to check out her work. She does hand-pieced type stuff like English paper piecing and that kind of thing. I think she's made 2 Dear Jane quilts. Another one of her quilts, I've done a couple of videos of her stuff, so you can look out for those. One is a blue and white little tumbler quilt. That's really amazing. And there's one with all kinds of applique and piecing, and it's just really incredible. All right, so I left that. Oh, there's a mistake, but I did go back and fix it. One of those arcs is facing the wrong way, and I left that 4-patch unquilted. I can't remember if I went back and filled that in or not. I don't know. This block I'm about to quilt is one of the rare ones that did not have teeny tiny pieces in it. There's a fair amount of backtracking here, but at least the increments are very tiny. I think I can be forgiven for that. This would be a great quilt, believe it or not, to hone your free motion quilting skills with, because you're just quilting from, you know, a 1/2 inch here to there, or 1 inch or something, and all the quilting is so darn simple. Look, it's just straight lines with a ruler, or little bitty continuous curves. If you were not real confident with your free motion quilting, this would give you all the practice in the world, which is what I want you to have. I'm always getting told, oh, Susan, I just can't make myself get in there and do the work. But that's how you build a comfort zone. You have to have some experience. And this kind of a quilt would definitely give you that. While I'm doing the continuous curve on the white pieces, I'm thinking, what am I going to do in the red squares? Just more continuous curve. Let's not make it real hard. Does it need anything more than that? No. Now here's where I'm thinking, well, I was gonna leave those red triangles unquilted. But no, that block needs more quilting. It just totally does. And just this little continuous curve is going to be enough. You get to focusing on the blocks with the little teeny tiny pieces and trying not to do too much. And then when you switch back to a block with regular size pieces, you know, it throws off your decision making and judgment a little bit. And now I kind of wish I'd quilted down the middle of that white stripe. That looks a lot better. This block also doesn't have too many tiny pieces. And look at those corner triangles with the stripe. That kind of makes me want to do something in there. Not a lot, just a little. Play up the stripe. More continuous curves. Get that pinwheel quilted efficiently. So this patch is kind of big. I don't want to put something snazzy in there, but it's not going to show because the fabric is that little check. So I'm quilting from the outer point kind of to the middle and then doing an echo of those straight lines. You could use a hair marker or some other marker to mark exactly where the middle is. I'm just kind of winging it here. aiming for the middle, and it's going to be fine because that patch is going to be hard to see. But I think that's really good. I like that part. Outlining the print. Trying to manage the fullness there. You ditch quilt first, and then you quilt the patch to stabilize it. The whole time I've been doing these lines and ditch quilting, I've been thinking, what am I going to do with those little flying geese? I like the linearity of how they're arranged. So I think I want to just do lines up the middle. If you go up and then come back down, you end up in the same place you were, which means more stops and starts. But I think there's going to be a lot of stops and starts here anyway. There already have been. Will one line up the middle be enough? And the only way you know is just to try it and find out. That's not a lot of ripping to do if I decide I don't like it. Those pieces are not very small, but I think there's even density there. I haven't over quilted any part of this block, so the one line I think is going to be okay. That to me is using restraint, because I'd like to put in 2 or 3 even. One line will be plenty. Just in case you're wondering, I'm not showing you video of every block. Not a chance. This is just a few. I've included quite a few, but they're still only just a few. This is what custom quilting is. Quilting for the long haul. But there's a lot of instant gratification happening here. Each little block is pretty satisfying. A lot of really good payoff. In the end, when it's all finished, you're going to see the quilt in its totality, and you won't see the quilting except if you focus and look at each individual block. So the quilting doesn't have to be the star of the show here. But it does play a pretty important role. This patch is where I ran out of restraint. I thought I was begging for something halfway ornate, so I did a little pattern meander of ribbon candy in there. I like it. I think it's what that little block needed. I think it's really cute. And I think I'm gonna outline that little flower in that middle red square. Isn't that cute? Or maybe I'll just continuous curve around that square. It still kind of features that little flower. The quilting encircles it. What would you have done there? We've seen some blocks with some fairly large pieces. Now look at the little tiny ones. Here is what's underneath some of the more intricate blocks. And you might think, well, how can you quilt those? Pretty easily. All that seam allowance did not cause a problem, but you do want to quilt it very simply and sparsely. But look, I still ditch quilted around those little bitty center squares. These were probably the most fun blocks because I was thinking, can I do a tiny continuous curve in there? You know, that's what I would do if the block was a lot bigger, probably. How is that going to work out? And the more I did, the more I fell in love with it. There's so many times when people tell me, well, there's not enough room, you can't do anything there. Yeah, there is. There's a ton of room. And even if you don't do a lot of quilting, it doesn't mean it needs no quilting. There was a lot here to do. It took me far less time to quilt them than it did for her to make those. I still wish I had video of how she cut out the little pieces and all the little papers she made, and you know, that's the part we didn't get to see. quilting the little white background triangles, well, part of the reason that was so much fun is it made the red patches stand up, which is one of the great things about quilting. You know, what you quilt down compresses, what you leave unquilted stands up and calls attention to itself. And the dimension here, with all that seam allowance, was pretty cool. And that's a really cool block. So I'm glad I quilted it the way I did. I think that is pretty darn good. This is one of my favorite blocks in this quilt because of the very center. I didn't measure, but those are the tiniest hexies I've ever seen. I think they're darling. This block is intimidating me. I don't know what I'm going to do there in the middle. You know, the outer edges, all those pieces, well, that's not too hard. Look how she fussy cut those triangles with the little flowers in the middle. But what am I going to do? Especially, okay, part of the challenge quilting around the hexies is that's going to be contrasting thread on a dark piece of fabric. One of these days I have to quit being scared of that. So it's nice to have all this outer block to quilt, you know, and work up some idea of what to do in the middle and come up with some alternatives. The outer border of that block is like a little white picket fence. See the block on the upper right part of the frame? Look, see how there's a little bit of blue in there? I like that part also. It's not solely a red and white quilt. Outline the print, because that's such a cute print to outline. That's more of that... I guess, I don't know if that's a hexagon or what. That's kind of a nod to the hexies in the middle. Now it's decision-making time. I've run out of other things to do on this block. What's going to happen in the middle? What could I do? It needs to be something ultra simple. That's a lot of room. I spent a lot of time standing there wondering. And then I thought, okay, just do some lines that emanate. See, the piecing points the way. And then I got all tangled up over the geometry. And I don't think I got it right, but I kind of don't think it makes that big of a difference. This ended up looking pretty decent. I was happy with it. I'm not exactly cross-hatching it, but something like that. A lot of times, the challenge is not to be brilliant. It's, you need to know what not to do. You need to know how not to mess it up. Even with the mistakes, I think this was a pretty good way to not overdo it. I mean, what else would you have done? Put in some circles. Then you'd see a stop and a start. Could quilt some little feathers in there. That just didn't. No, that was way too much trouble for not really good payoff. I could have done radiating lines. These lines kind of radiate, but it's not overkill. I didn't want it to take all day. I didn't want to overshadow those little tiny pieces. So where did that idea come from? Well, I think the universe likes to help me out. The idea popped into my head, and I don't think I was the one who thought it up. I think we don't quilt alone. In the book, The Artist's Way, Julia Cameron says, the great creator is very interested in you and your creativity and likes to help. I believe I had already stabilized those hexes with clear thread, I think. See, that's pretty good. I like that. And then I ditch quilted around that middle hexie. Which I thoroughly believe was the right thing to have done. Maybe I should have continuous curved those white patches. I don't know. There's the hem gauge for some scale. I liked the pieces of fabric that had circles in them. I ended up quilting around those circles. This quilt is all angles and straight lines and squares, so I think the circles really helped a lot. If you'll notice on the left side of this block, I had continuous curved, and then later it occurred to me, no, quilt around those circles. So I did go back, I took that out of that one patch and quilted the circle. The continuous curve on the red was plenty, the part in the white needed to be outlined. What a fun block. This block was fun for some all different reasons. I thought about ditch quilting along each seam here, and then I thought, no, let's just do lines across the whole of it. That would be a good way and a satisfying way to quilt all those little bars. It's nice and fun to quilt across the length of them. You get a whole different texture, and I don't know. I can't really explain why that's good and satisfying, but it is. And then in the end, decided to just cross-hatch the heck out of that middle checkerboard. In retrospect, some of these decisions seem obvious, but at the time, they are not. Swirl. Thanks for joining me on this tour of quilting these little 6-inch blocks. But now for something completely different. Let's talk about the border. All right, what I'm doing here is how the whole border should have gone. It should have gone this smoothly, but it didn't. So here's what I'm getting at. Part of the reason I decided to quilt the border in this manner is there were some problems I saw while I was stabilizing, and I didn't think it was going to be a big deal because I've been around problem borders before. In the end, I decided upon this design because I could quilt those straight lines first and then do a pattern meander in the middle of those channels. And that would help me smooth out the fullness. That would divide and conquer the fullness of that border. And I can successfully make it behave. So it went fine for a good long while. Probably two sides of the border had a little bit of fullness. I mean, okay, you can see it just to the right of what I'm quilting. And that doesn't mean there's anything wrong. That's just the unquilted part of the quilt, and it's just one big solid piece of fabric. So it's going to be full. It's not very stabilized except for the edge. So I like to stabilize as I stabilize. And here that meant those pins. Even on a long arm, the presser foot wants to push the fabric around, and I want it to not move around. So often just putting in a few pins will hold it into place, and that'll be fine. So what I want to draw your attention to now is the setting triangles at the edge that meets the two borders, that meets that red border and the outer white border. What a lot of people don't realize is that that's half a block, and it's cut along the bias. The bias is a really stretchy part of fabric. And a lot of people don't know what the bias even is. The straight grain, the crosswise grain, those kinds of things. If you come from a garment construction background, if you had homemaking in school, if you make your own clothes, you may have learned through a lesson or learned the hard way that those grain lines make a huge difference. And they really do in quilting. So if you haul off and strip piece a border on the crosswise grain to bias edge setting triangles, you're going to get a ruffle. And I mean, I've had numerous clients who bring me quilts and they go, well, I didn't have a problem. What are you talking about? And I can see it right off. On this quilt, I could see in places that there were some problems, but I did not think it was severe. And I thought, I've been around this issue long enough that I'll be able to do what I'm doing right here, just exactly what you're watching, and it'll all be fine. But there were a few places in two sides of the borders where there was so much fullness. And the usual tricks I've got up my sleeve, double bat the border. That wasn't going to work here. By the time I realized I probably should need to do that, I'd already quilted two sides of it. There's the corner with elbow quilting. See how pretty, see how uniform and lovely that's meant to look? Really good. And then here's the rough patch. These are the rapids. You can see the fullness right there where the red border meets that half cornerstone. So I picked out the stabilizing quilting along the edge, and I've pinned the border to even out all the fullness. And here's my trick. You pull gently the bat and the top border, and as you sew, with varying success, you'll be able to ease that in there. And if need be, put some more pins in there to help even it all out. Well, part of the reason I couldn't double bat this is you don't want to double bat two sides of the border and leave the others unbatted, undouble batted. The double bat I'd want to put in there would be some wool bat, because it's really lofty. But this is a white quilt, and I don't want there to... See, the wool batting is not white, so you'll change the color. And that won't be a bad thing, except two sides of the border will be one color and the other two sides will be some other color. There's a lot of tricks long armers have up their sleeves when doing pantographs. You spray water on the quilt and let it draw up. You spray some starch on the quilt, and when it's drying, it'll draw up. I don't want to put any water on a red and white quilt or any other liquid, so I'm not going to do that. I don't know if she's pre-washed her fabric. Even if you have pre-washed your fabric, it can still run the color, that is. I've had a lot of experience with that. You know, how many quilt shows the night before the show, or the night before I'm supposed to go turn the quilt in, I'm painting the bleed away with a solution of bleach and water. And that works. It's a long process, but it's also really tricky because, you know, the moisture is going to travel, and you'll wake up the next morning and look, the bleach will have migrated over into the red and it'll be completely discolored. So I love that trick. I love the client who told me about it, but I wasn't about to do that here. So I'm just going to have to tough it out. This was a real test. In the end, this worked very well. I could still see some parts that had some unfortunate puckers. But the client said she couldn't find where I'd had the trouble, which is one of the highest compliments I've ever received. This is great. Years ago, I had a client who called me a miracle worker because I could always find a way to get their mistakes not to show. This is good and bad. I don't want to have to work miracles on your quilt. But the fact that I've got some tricks up my sleeve is really good and handy. I have lots of experience working with ruffly borders. So I'm not trying to blame the client here. She didn't do anything wrong. She'd never had the experience of working with the bias edge of a setting triangle up against the borders. She did put her borders on correctly. So I'm not trying to criticize, but the bias and the crosswise grain will make a fool out of you at every turn. See, that looks a lot better to me. It's still quite the formidable challenge. So here's the grain explained. This is the straight grain. See how there's hardly any give there at all? This is the crosswise grain. See the stretch. This is how jelly rolls and things like that are cut. They're cut on the crosswise grain because it's convenient to cut it that way. And most people who piece love those and they think they're great. And that presents problems for quilters, though, for machine quilters. All right, and here's the bias. That's a lot of stretch. This is great if your skirt is a bias cut. You know, it's going to hang and drape really beautifully, but that's not what you want in your, well, that can create a lot of problems when you're piecing, and especially if you're quilting. So if you came from a garment construction background, you already know this stuff. But if you didn't, and you're thinking, well, why does this matter? Oh, it matters a lot. It matters a lot to the success of your quilt. Does it hang straight? Do your blocks fit? If you cut a piece that needed to be on the straight and you cut it here on the bias, do you know how to compensate for that kind of thing? If you starched your fabric before you cut it up, that might help you some, but not knowing this can be really bad for your quilt. Here is a feathered star quilt I'm making. There will be borders on which I'm going to applique some flowers. That's my flower on the lower right that I have designed. We'll see if that works. But with applique, you know, I will be handling those borders a lot. So I really don't want those border pieces to stretch. I've cut them on the straight grain. The setting triangles, top and bottom and sides, are not on the bias, but let's assume they are. So then, do I want to measure, you know, this edge? No, I don't. I want something more stable. So I'm going to measure from here to here. And that's how wide I'm going to cut that border. And either it's going to get eased in or stretched. You know, find a way to make this seam work so that this fabric is not a big wavy ruffle. And so once I've got the top and the bottom borders put on, then I can take some more measurements and put these side ones on. And that will mean a whole new measurement that includes this top border, the body of the quilt, and the bottom border. Now, theoretically, that ought to work. But, you know, what you want to avoid at all costs is just a long strip of fabric that's just strip pieced onto the side, and who knows what you'll end up with. Here is a look at that problem border. You can't really tell there was a problem at all. So, here is the finished quilt. How fun was that? I had a blast. It was a long haul, but I think it turned out pretty well. It's not perfect. I made some mistakes in here, but I like what we ended up with. It's just block after block of delight. So I really hope you enjoyed seeing this and hung in there for most of it. I know it was asking a lot to watch something this long, but it took a long time to quilt it. She spent 10 months making these blocks. So almost a month quilting it isn't that big of a deal. It's pretty awesome stuff. We'll see you next time.